having this conversation tonight on TV, obviously. We're also having this on our Facebook page at CBC's Toronto Facebook page, as well as right across the province. So we want you at home to log on to our Facebook page and join in on the conversation. You can ask questions, put them right at the bottom of the screen there, and we will put them to our panelists. And as I bring them up, let's introduce them. We have Arezoo Najibzadeh, who is with the Young Women's Leadership Network. And we have Arjun, Sahota. You're a member of the Toronto Youth Cabinet. Thank you so much for being here, both of you. And both of these guys were part of the Youth Town Hall that just took place about a week ago. We had 3 of the 4 main party leaders that were there. Doug Ford was not at that event. But as you've listened to those party leaders and as you've been talking with your networks, let's start with you, Arezoo. What do you think is the biggest issue facing millennials in this provincial election?
I think we work with a lot of young women who are millennials and who are entering our workspaces and who are students across the province. And I think the main issue that keeps coming up is having communities that are thriving, communities that have access to healthcare and dental care and high rates of employment, who have great transit and affordable social housing. I think it's really important to box millennials, youth issues, or women's issues into specific areas. But through the conversations that we've been having, we've learned that it's really important for us to address issues and demographics on a holistic level and to really try to address the issues that communities across the province are facing based on the needs that they have, depending on their identities and the experiences that they bring with themselves.
Because so many people, just because they're young, doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to have totally different requirements or things from the parties that they need and that they're looking for. Arjun, what do you think? If you were to pick kind of the biggest issue that you're seeing from your network, what do you think the biggest issue is for young voters in particular?
For sure. So my role at the Toronto Youth Cabinet is that of chair, and so I'm kind of tasked with advocating for the 320,000 young people within the city of Toronto. Having gone to both the town hall and seen the debate on TV last week, let's just be candid here. Every issue is a youth issue. Whether or not it affects youth today, if we don't deal with an issue today, it's going to affect us down the road. It's going to affect us in the future. The biggest one, I think, and it was absent in both the last debate and in the town hall, was youth employment. Toronto in particular has a youth unemployment rate of about 17% or 18%. Ontario's is at 13. So when we have party leaders coming out and saying unemployment in Ontario is the lowest it's been in 2 decades, youth are not seeing that. We're not feeling that. So let's start talking about unemployment for youth, and that directly relates to housing and transit systems as well. So as we're having these bigger conversations about building transit, and every party leader has confirmed, like, we're going to come out and invest billions of dollars into transit, what about the jobs? What about getting young people the work necessary to be able to use that transit? So I think I really believe that we're missing out on a big area, and all party leaders are just kind of silencing it in the fact of the big things like, hey, we're going to build a subway for you.
Right. Arezoo, what do you think is, he raises a good point, what leaders are talking about, but also what they aren't talking about. What kind of issue do you think is being ignored by the major party leaders right now?
I think an issue that's really important to young women is the progress that we've made in the past few years in terms of addressing gender-based violence and sexual violence in our workplaces, on our campuses, and within the province in general. And I think voters want to make sure that we're not, moving back on all the promises and all the progress that's been made. So I would like to see leaders from all parties really recommit to addressing these issues if elected, as premier or as government. Because again, we can't afford to lose the consent and sexual health education that we have. We can't afford to lose, the 5 days paid domestic leave, leave for victims of domestic violence that we have. So really to make sure that we keep looking forward and not moving back when we're talking to our leaders and choosing our next government.
Okay, and when we're looking at some other bigger issues here, it's also about engagement with young voters, and we're going to be talking about all of this as we continue this discussion on our Facebook pages right across the province of Ontario. But for now, Dwight, we'll send it back to you in the studio. So as we say goodbye to our TV audience, we'll bring it back here. And that was, I think, a good question, because we do hear so often that young voters tend to turn out to the polls less than older voters. So I guess Arezoo, what do you think is the number one thing that we need to do to get young people to actually be motivated enough to head to the polls and cast a ballot?
Yeah, what we saw at the town hall was that young people are eager to meaningfully engage with our political systems and with our leaders. We had a great turnout every time, I think either the TYC or us, when we hold events to talk about issues, young people show up and they want to talk. So I think one thing that we're missing is that face-to-face, meaningful conversation with our leaders and with our candidates. I mean, even Elections Ontario at this point, a lot of the outreach they do to young people is through social media and digital engagement, and that's important, and we need to address that, but also how are we really going to have these conversations about important issues with the young people in our communities to make sure that they not only see their issues represented in our political conversations, but that they see the value in actually engaging through ways other than maybe protesting or showing up to meetings such as voting, which has a great impact on our present but also the future of our province.
Absolutely. Okay. And as we were saying off the top, we want you at home to chime in. I mean, this is all about having a discussion about what's important to you. But we are lucky enough to have a bunch of people here, so we'll take one of their questions now. You're up first. Just identify yourself with the people at home, and then what's your question?
My name's Gresham Bailey, and I've got a few questions, but probably what came up to mind as you were speaking is about employment, the employment rate. My wife and I own Bailey's Brew Bar, which we're in right now, and there was a few decisions made in the last year that really affected how we operate our business. Some were municipal decisions, some were provincial, and minimum wage obviously being one of them, having a small business, small shop here, and we actually had to cut shifts and cut staff when that change was made. And it's not that we didn't believe in the decisions being made or agree that minimum wage had to be raised, but it was just maybe how abrupt it was and how quick it was put into motion to play that we feel like it my question I guess would be is how do we make more of an impact on that? And we need to find a candidate, I guess, from our side that is going to let us have more of a vote. I'm part of we're part of the small business union here in Toronto and in Ontario. So we do these votes and these different things, which hopefully do have an impact. But it's difficult. We hate to see employees and friends lose their jobs, and we have to take over more shifts and more hours in here.
Well, and that brings up a really good point that I've been around to a few different regions in the province over the last couple of weeks of the campaign, and small business and generating employment for young people is definitely something that I've heard a lot of places, and I know the leaders have as well. So, Arjun, since you talked about employment off the top, if you could kind of chime in and address that a little bit, what do you think are some of those barriers to employment that could help stimulate the economy and help young people get to work?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your question, number one. Let's be honest, everyone deserves a living wage, and I don't think anyone's arguing that minimum wage shouldn't be at 14. Was the process of getting to 14 a big jump? Absolutely. We went from 11.40 to 14. It's a 22% increase for any business to absorb overnight, to go from December 31st to January 1st. How we can address that? Right now, the government of Ontario actually has an employment branch for young people in particular. They invest about $90 million a year into that branch. It's called Employment Ontario. The success rates of that programming is about 46%, and none of the leaders are talking about that. So we're investing $90 million into a fund from taxpayer dollars, and the $90 million is really used to offset expenditures for small business. And essentially, it would work in the sense that if a small business hires a young person, they get reimbursed on an annual basis or on a monthly basis for whatever cost they provide to that young person. How many businesses have the ability to pay out upfront and wait for that reimbursement? Cash flow is a major issue. How many young people know about that programming? That's another issue. And I know young people like myself, I actually tried to enroll in that program at one point, and I was turned down because I was a university student and very, very engaged, and they said, you don't need support in getting employment. And they said I wasn't a multi-barrier young person. So when we have 46% success in a program and you're turning young people like me down who really want to help the small businesses, that's a huge problem. And I think that we need to really redevelop the way the government of Ontario sees the youth employment strategy.
Arezoo, what do you think? What would be a priority for any of the party leaders to consider when they're thinking about stimulating the economy to help young people find work?
I think higher access to education and leadership opportunities for young people has been something that keeps, that has kept coming up in our conversations. And we have the new OSAP programs that have been rolled out in the past few years, but still we see that a lot of continuing education and adult students being turned away by that program. And students in Ontario have the lowest per student investment from the government out of all the provinces in the country. So to really look at the high cost of education and who gets to access the OSAP and the grants and the programming that's in place to assist with that is really a major problem for a lot of the young women that we keep talking about. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so we mentioned that we are on Facebook, but obviously people are chiming in on different social media platforms as well. We just got a question in from Twitter, from Xenia on Twitter, who asks, how do the parties plan to address housing and, as we've just mentioned, employment issues in Ontario City? So since we've talked so much about employment, why don't we pick up that housing bit, because that's something that at CBC we've talked extensively about, the issues with housing, affordable housing, but even just housing for the wide swath of citizens. So if you were to see a policy put in place or some sort of change come to the city, what would you like to see in terms of housing?
There's a huge lack in social housing and affordable housing in Toronto, but also across other regions. I live in York region where poverty is almost invisible. We talk a lot about the downtown core and housing issues here, but when we look at rural areas and suburbs and areas that are not necessarily always the main drivers of conversation within our political systems are really being hit by a lack of access to housing and, again, employment. So try to focus, broaden our focus to other communities that are really facing challenges when it comes to employment, to housing, to transit, and create communities instead of, promising different programs and different investment. Having a wider vision of what we want our province and our communities to look like will really help with that.
Arjun, what do you think? What should be done to help out with the housing situation, not just here in Toronto, but across Ontario?
I absolutely agree with Arezoo. I think that we were looking at this housing issue and saying, let's just build more houses. And 2 weeks ago, we saw the party leaders come out and say, hey, let's take a portion of the Greenbelt away and build housing, and it'll fix all our problems. As a millennial myself, I think that I fairly accepted that I'm not going to purchase a home or property in the city of Toronto. It's simply not possible with what we're seeing. How can we solve that issue? More affordable housing, more strict rent controls. Let's bring back the speculation tax on home buyers. Home buyers should not be able to purchase a property and flip it right in a couple months or 1 month or 2 months. That is absolutely unethical. We should not be allowed to do that. Let's bring that speculation tax back, and then let's re-regulate the market. I think on a federal scope, we're going to definitely see the housing market cool down a little bit with interest rates going up over the next couple of years, and we're expecting them to go back up 2 points again in the next year or so. So we will see some alleviation, but there's not more land being made. So with the land that's left and the land that we're able to develop, let's really be strategic about it in developing what type of properties we want and what type of communities we want.
Okay, we'll go online again for another question. This one is from Raphael. I'm sorry if I'm saying your last name wrong. Lode in Ottawa. He asks an interesting question. Millennials are struggling to start families. How will voting make marriage and children easier? What do you think about that question?
I think a lot of that goes back to access to housing and access to employment and conditions that really allow for people to be able to start a new life and take risks in their lives. When you don't have that stability when it comes to where am I going to live? How am I going to feed my family? How am I, what are my children going to have access to in the future? I think having that stability and having that vision for what our province is going to look like is really going to help with people who don't necessarily just not even want to start families but want to take bigger risks in their lives, to want to go back to school, to want to maybe move to different areas within the province and see growth there. So I think that stability and that collective vision for our province is really going to help with that.
Arjun, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. If we don't have affordability and we're not really sure how to take care of ourselves, how can we even fathom to start a family and to really make that independent step and be dependent as a unit? How can we solve that? Again, it's a multi-barrier problem, and And the best way is bringing employment. One of the scariest things is that in the next 10 years, RBC released a report a couple weeks ago about humans wanted. In the next 10 years, we're going to see 50% of jobs today fundamentally change. Whether that be the location that they're done in, the skills necessary to do that work, or the salary associated with that job. So if we don't have a government, and any government that's elected this year is going to be in office, ideally, for 4 years or so, almost half a decade, we really need to make sure that the government that we elect is going to be cognizant that work is going to change. And how can we develop, again, a youth employment strategy or an employment strategy across the province that's adding those skills to young people and reducing the access to opportunities for young people to reintegrate to post-secondary or even secondary school and gaining those skills. And how can we make our institutions that are provincially funded, our educational institutions, be more adapt to what curriculum we need in the next decade coming up.
Absolutely. And speaking about how industries and jobs are changing, I mean, so much of the focus of what we do now is online. And of course, we just want to remind you, if you have a question at home, you want to join this conversation, please go ahead and ask that. But we do have one more question from the crew that we've assembled here. Please identify yourself and what's your question?
Hey, my name is Yelena Lazarevich, and my question is centered more around millennial engagement. So, knowing that parties are easily swayed people, and we're all easily swayed by certain messages or certain individuals, how do you get millennials to engage beyond that? So kind of looking at platforms and looking at the specific issues that different parties and people are trying to focus and hone in on, and actually look at how that will impact them, as opposed to just focusing on a party or there are certain messages. You know, when we're inundated by so many messages, it's easy to kind of get lost in all of that noise.
Yelena, I love that question because so often when I'm talking to people and asking questions like this, I hear, I'm not really that political. It doesn't affect me. And I think it affects everyone. And I hope that that's what we're kind of showcasing here with this conversation, is that it does affect a lot of people. So when we're talking about this kind of how do we get people to engage, Arezoo, what do you think? What would be the best way to foster that engagement and get more people to pay attention to the parties in a real way and know what they're voting for?
Well, it's a fact that millennials are very engaged in our communities. We advocate for a lot of issues. We're engaged in so many different community groups, and we care about issues that impact our communities and our lives. And that was kind of something that we saw at the town hall, where Mike Schreiner was really hitting on some key issues that a lot of young people care about. It was taking care of our environment and electoral reform. Whereas, the other two leaders were more talking about their plans and, what they're going to bring if elected, as premier. And I think it's really important for us to understand that young people aren't apathetic. We're not uninformed about issues that impact us. We really need a collective commitment from our politicians, from our leaders, and from our governments to engage with us in the issues that matter to us. Because again, that messaging can be there, but what's behind it? How is it going to impact our day-to-day lives? And that is not a conversation that we're having as a collective and as a society. And I think that's where we should be looking at.
And a part of, I think, what we can do, too, is realize how influential we can be in an election. Because if we look back to, and we were speaking about this just before we went on air, but the 2015 election, where we saw so many young people across the country engage in politics and get out to the polls and vote, there was a real influential tide that came from that. So, Arjun, what do you think? I mean, maybe looking at the 2015 federal election and maybe drawing some parallels here with what's going on in Ontario, but what do you think needs to happen to have more young people not just be engaged and motivated, but actually cast that ballot?
Yeah, so first I just want to say that about a week ago, both of our organizations were partnered up and collaborating for a leaders debate or a leaders town hall. We had 250 young people out on a weekday mid-afternoon. So let that sink in for a second. I don't think we've seen that in past elections, and so I think that's amazing.
Are you chirping our crew here? Is that what you're trying? No, I'm just kidding. Go on.
And so just to say that youth, in terms of engagement, the best way is to have discussions just like this one. And I think even to come out on a weekday evening for each and every one of you to dedicate your time and to learn more about the different platforms and how to get involved is amazing. One of the things I think was extremely irresponsible of every single party leader was having that first debate before the writ dropped. So what we're hearing as young people is we're seeing party leaders, but when we go to the ballot box, we're voting for different names. We're voting for our local representative. And I don't know about anyone else in this room, I don't vote for parties. I vote for the name on the ballot, because when I have a problem in my community, that's the person that I'm going to be seeing. If I have a question in my community, that's the person I'm going to be seeing. So for us to have a leaders debate and hear all about each and every different party, and number one, actually, one of the parties was excluded, which again, I think is absolutely irresponsible. So when we're having these discussions, the party leaders go out and they make their platforms very clear. But for young people, it's difficult to get engaged and get involved when they're out doing their dance and we don't know who we're going to be voting for come election day. I didn't know who the local representative was going to be for one of the parties in my community until Monday, until election writ was dropped. And so it's more about having not only just the party leaders going around the province and announcing amazing investments and amazing promises, which again is necessary, but it's about getting every person on the party campaign on board and maybe even making the campaign period longer. Maybe making it 8 weeks, because it was no surprise when writ dropped that, oh, we're going to have an election June 7th. I think everybody's known for the last at least 20 weeks, especially in this field, that an election's coming up. Just make the election period longer.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think that it also does fall to the person a little bit. Like, there needs to be some buy-in from the citizens to make sure that they do research, not just on the major parties and the leaders, but also who's running in my backyard, so that they can be dialed in and pay attention and know who will be ultimately representing them. If I can shift again to a Facebook question, we have something from Hugh McDonald from Ottawa, who asks a really interesting question, because we've seen so much conversation when I was covering the budget about deficits and deficit spending. And you hear the line so often, we're mortgaging the future, when we run such high deficits. But the question from Hugh here is, do millennials care about how large the deficit is? What do you think? Do you think that this is something that young people care about, or should they care about this?
I think business or political jargon can a lot of times come in the way of how young people not only interact with our politics, but how they understand our economy and how everything works. You know, we were talking about the issues and the messaging around each party's platform. You know, it's easy to say we have, we have a small deficit, we have a big, huge deficit. But how is that going to really impact young people? How is that going to impact our employment rates? How is that going to impact our access to education and a higher quality of life? I think that's what young people are concerned about, and making sure that we have financial literacy being taught in our schools through the new curriculums that have been introduced in the past couple of years. That is going to make a difference with, around how we not only understand our economy, but how, again, we choose our local representatives and which parties we support.
Well, and sometimes it can be hard enough to figure out a couple of thousand, let alone a couple of billion and more in some cases. But what do you think? I mean, the question's an interesting one. Do millennials care about deficit spending, and should they?
So just based on speaking to probably the hundreds of youth we've had the opportunity to consult with at the Toronto Youth Cabinet over the last year, I don't believe young people, it's not the forefront issue. I think if a government comes in and says, we're going to balance the books, we're not going to have any deficit, but we're not going to have any social programs anymore, young people would care more about that. So if we're investing in the right things, if we're investing responsibly, I really believe that's what young people care about more. Again, looking at a program by the government of Ontario right now with a 46% success rate and 90 million going into it, great program, but maybe it's not working. And I think that's what young people care about more than just spending the 90 million. How well is it working? And so if there's a deficit, I really don't believe that young people see it as a wage on our future. Again, it's supporting access to opportunity for us, and we are going to be able to invest in us as a society and improve the standard of living and the quality of living for the future.
Okay. Let's take it to the audience for another question. Please identify yourself, and what's your question?
I'm Josiane Mojam. My question is about the cost of living in the whole GTA. I know you mentioned employment and housing across the whole Ontario, but what are the actions that will be taken to change the cost of living in GTA? Because as a young person, it's very challenging to live in this city. Even though we love the city, it's very, very costly to live here. So what are the actions that will be taken to make the GTA more affordable for young people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's a tough one to answer because there's so many different pieces to affordability. But Arjun, why don't we start with you? What do you think that the leaders should be doing to make it more affordable for young people?
So I know the audience member had asked about the GTA or the GTHA. I think as young people, we can be honest with ourselves and say maybe the GTA or the GTHA might not be the place to live as well, right? Maybe we can go out of the GTA and the GTHA to have still a very vibrant and exuberant life. But again, that comes with transit investment. So that's one of the things the leaders might be able to do. So maybe we'll shift out of moving from the city, but we'll still be able to access the city very, very easily. The other half is what the government's currently doing. The rise of minimum wage was built to make sure that people have a living wage. If there's a young person or anybody in the province that's working full-time on minimum wage, I believe they shouldn't have to depend on social services or wonder where their next meal is coming from. And I think so far we've done a great job with that. To speak more in particulars, lowering business tax would be one of the opportunities, particularly maybe in the province of Ontario, to make the cost of living more sustainable just by reducing the corporate tax rate. Business will be able to price their products and services on a more scale basis. And then maybe even farmer subsidies, and those are all things that we can look at as we go more in depth into the issue. But I really think as millennials, we shouldn't be set on Toronto's the main place to live or Toronto's my only place to live. We should be more so open to moving out and getting that transit built so it's not a burden on our lifestyle to move out of GTHA.
Yeah, that's a great point about how you don't have to necessarily live in the core. But I would say, though, that a lot of people want to live, in some cases, where they were raised, and whether that's Hamilton or the Ottawa area or Thunder Bay. I mean, house prices are expensive here in the city, but there's hydro rates that are expensive, grocery bills are going up. The affordability question maybe is more severe in some parts of the province than others, but generally there is an issue with affordability for a lot of people. What do you think that the party leaders should do province-wide to help out with affordability and how tough it is sometimes to afford to live?
I think it's really important for us to make sure that, when we're talking about millennials or even young women, that this is not a monolith. We have so many people who are again, multi-barriered folks who face issues based on not only the geography of the places they live, but based on how, the access they have to healthcare or access to food. I mean, we know like in Northern Ontario and healthcare, that's a huge issue. There are Indigenous reservations and there are towns in Northern Ontario that live 4 or 5 hours away from hospitals and healthcare. But to make sure that we are building communities that are sustainable and that are responsive to the needs of young people and Ontarians in general is something that keeps coming up in the conversations we're having. We think about, we hear a lot about urban investment and investment in employment opportunities in the downtown core and in core cities, but we're not looking at, okay, where are we building the new subway lines and what will the folks who will be moving there needing? Because we have the new subway lines that are going up to Vaughan, and then you look at the Downsview subway station and there's no development around it. There's no housing, there's no access to healthcare, there's no access to employment around that area. To make sure that we are investing in communities and not one-off solutions to each one of these issues, it's really important, and that should be the guiding principle of any investment or government regulation.
Just if I could touch on that, though, I know that when we look at the Downsview Station area and maybe some newer subway areas, and maybe even proposed subway areas, we're not seeing that key development there yet. I think this brings a quick question of the chicken or the egg, whether or not we need development to build subways or whether or not we need subways to build development. Historically, if we look at the way the GTA has been built and the way that other major cities across North America have been built, transit leads and development follows. And we're seeing that on the Shepherd Line finally, and I think over the next decade or so, we're going to be seeing it on the new subway proposed lines and the current lines that just opened this year.
And there's a way of doing both of that in York Region. We're seeing a lot of Metrolinx growth and a lot of local transit growth, but alongside that, we're seeing a lot of investment in local businesses and a lot of housing being built. So I think it's possible to find the middle ground and a balance between those options.
Okay, good. We'll go online for another question. This one is from Rayan from Hamilton. He asks 2 questions. The first one we've kind of touched on a couple times about getting youth engaged and getting out to vote. So I'll go to the second question here, which I think is important for us all to talk about. What ideas do the youth have regarding care and support of the silver tsunami that's coming faster than lightning? Obviously, he's talking about grandparents and parents and an aging population. So what do you think? would be a priority for people who are worried about caring and supporting their elderly generations.
I think, again, access to employment and to affordable healthcare is really important, because we see a lot of young people who are precariously employed and who won't necessarily have the same opportunities that our prior generations had to maybe retiring early on and having higher access to community supports. And I think that's really important. And to look at it from a gendered lens, we know that young women are some of the most and highly precarious employed demographics in our country and in the GTA, and specifically in Toronto. So looking at how that will impact different demographics and who's historically been concerned with taking care of the elders or even the children. I mean, childcare is also a huge issue that a lot of the leaders have been talking about, to really take all of those things into our minds when we're answering questions like this. Look at the access to education, access to employment, access to affordable housing, but also look at how we're building the future of our jobs and workplaces, so prepare for that.
Well, and so often when you hear about this, you think personal care beds, really. And we've heard a few different promises from the different parties about 30,000 personal care beds over the next 10 years or so. Some are saying that it needs to happen even faster. Others are saying that we need to invest in different parts of the healthcare system. So obviously there's that peg. But what do you think, Arjun? What would you, as we have this silver tsunami that's coming our way, what do we need to do?
So I've never heard of it referred to like that, so that's
I
awesome.
haven't either. I like it.
I was like, what is that?
I hope I got that right.
That's what I said at first, actually.
I hope that's what he meant.
So again, I think Arezoo really touched on it when she said that we really need to focus on getting young people the access to opportunity to get stable jobs, stable employment, so they are able to take care of the elderly in their lives and those that they're impacted by. But I don't think we can forget about the infrastructure that the province is lacking. We have a really poor hospital network. I think across Canada we have solid access to healthcare, but when we look at it on a micro level in Ontario, we don't have a strong hospital system. We have hospitals that people have to wait 3, 4, 5 hours. Nurses funding has been cut over the last 5-10 years as well. So with probably the largest grouping of seniors becoming seniors in Canada's history, we have to really strengthen our hospital network and the infrastructure that we have to deal with it. That being said, this is also the most wealthy generation of seniors in Canada's history as well, and so I don't think we should just take it to granted and say this is a problem that young people have to focus on solely. I think that, again, being the most wealthy generation of seniors in Canada's history, there is a responsibility on that generation as well to develop that infrastructure and take a stance on developing that infrastructure, maybe even being part of it in terms of financing and making that happen.
Well, when you talk about different parts of the province having difficulties with healthcare, I mean, I was just out in Brampton yesterday, and they were talking about how they're the lowest funded per capita when it comes to healthcare dollars because their community has grown so quickly, and that's a trouble that we're having in different parts. It's also a big success for different parts of the province as well, because we have these places that are booming, these neighborhoods that are booming, and then it's what do we do for those communities. Well, I think that takes us to almost our time here. If we could have both of you, we'll start with you, just kind of your last thoughts, your final thoughts on what you're hoping people will pay attention to, or what your last thoughts are on this millennial panel discussion.
I just really hope that young people in Ontario turn out to vote, not only on June 7th, but that they're returning offices all through to June 6th. You can't go in, you don't need to be registered. You can just go in with a piece of ID that has your full name and your address on it, and then you can cast your ballot to make sure that we turn out and we vote for the candidates we believe in and for the candidates that we know are going to be great advocates for our communities. Back in Queen's Park, that's really important, and we need to make sure that we turn out to vote not only for ourselves but for our communities as well.
Arjun, any last words?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to speak on Arezoo's point, I voted 3 times now since I turned 18. One of them was for myself. I was actually a candidate, and to this day I'm not on the voters list. And so just to touch on that, so you might not be on the voters list as young people. Try to make sure there's an Ontario elections website that you can make sure that you're on the voters list. If you're not, like Arezoo said, take a piece of ID on election day. Make sure to get out there. Make sure to vote. And one of the things I had heard at the town hall was if you look at the world today, you really see that 0.01% of people have created every pivotal idea, whether that be the vehicle or the shipping container, any major idea you see, that's 0.0% of the human population's history that's created those ideas. What if we could increase the access to opportunities to make that number 0.02%? So when voting as young people, let's try to look at each and every platform and see which platform is looking into the future, which platform is looking at the access of opportunities for young people, and make that vote, make your vote really count.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks a lot. I mean, this panel discussion wasn't necessarily meant to answer all of the problems that we have in the province, but I think it was a good start to get some of those ideas rolling, and we'll have a lot more over the next coming weeks as we get closer to June 7th for that election. Thank you guys so much for being a part of the panel discussion. Thanks to the audience for turning out and spending a little bit of time with us. And a big thank you to Bailey's Brew Bar for having us here. Thanks, guys. And also thanks for our audience online. We got a bunch of questions from Facebook and Twitter, and it's always great to see that engagement. So just remember that CBC Toronto has you covered for all your election news and updates and the platforms as they continue to roll out over the next few weeks. And you can always catch that at cbc.ca/Ontario Votes.